Good afternoon and welcome to today's webcast titled USDA's National Water Quality Initiative. This webcast is sponsored by EPA's Watershed Academy and EPA's Office of Wetlands, Oceans, and Watersheds, also known as OWOW. I am Ann Weinberg with EPA's Watershed Academy, and I will be moderating the webcast today along with Don Wade of OWOW's Non-Point Source Control Branch. Thank you all for joining us today. We'll start by going over a few housekeeping items. The materials of this webcast have been reviewed by EPA staff for technical accuracy. However, the views of the speakers or the speakers' organizations are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the EPA. Mention of any commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not mean that EPA endorses them. Move the slide. Okay. Now I want to briefly summarize some of the features of today's webcast. We encourage you to submit questions to our speakers during this webcast. To ask your questions, simply type in the questions box on your control panel and click Send. If your control panel is not showing, simply click on the small orange box with the white arrow to expand it. If you have any technical issues, you can let us know by also entering them in the questions box to the right of your screen and then clicking on the Send button. We'll do our best to respond to your issue by posting and answering the questions box. This webcast will be recorded and archived so you can access it in a few weeks after today's live presentation. The archived webcast will be posted on EPA's Watershed Academy webcast page at epa.gov/watershed webcast. That's with the plural. And now we have completed our discussion of housekeeping items. Let's kick off today's webcast. In this webcast, you're going to hear about USDA's National Water Quality Initiative, referred to as NWQI, which is focusing on 157 priority watersheds in the United States in 2012. These 157 watersheds were identified with assistance from state agencies, key partners, and USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, often referred to as NRCS. They're NRCS state technical committees. NRCS is making at least $33 million in financial assistance available to farmers, ranchers, and forest landowners this year in these priority watersheds to implement conservation practices to improve water quality and aquatic habitats in impaired lakes, streams, and other water bodies. Using funds from the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, also referred to as EQIP, NRCS will provide financial and technical assistance to producers for implementing conservation practices such as nutrient management, residue management, conservation cropping systems, cover crops, filter strips, and water and sediment control basins. This webcast will highlight how this initiative is working and how USDA's NRCS is working with state water quality agencies and others to implement this initiative in priority watersheds. Without further delay, I want to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker is Linda Hall. She is Chief of the Non-Point Source Control Branch in US EPA's Office of Wetlands, Oceans, and Watersheds. Linda has been with US EPA working to improve environmental management and water quality for more than 20 years. She has served in a number of management positions at EPA, and this past winter moved to lead EPA's Non-Point Source Control Branch, which has responsibility for managing the Section 319 Non-Point Source program. Our second speaker is Tom Christensen. He is the Regional Conservationist of the Central Region at USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service. Tom has worked with NRCS for over 32 years and has served in a number of leadership positions at NRCS. In his current position as Regional Conservationist, he is responsible for providing overall direction of NRCS personnel, programs, and activities from the Northern Plains and Upper Midwest to the Gulf of Mexico. Tom acts as a representative of the Chief in regional partnerships and in initiatives such as the National Water Quality Initiative. He has received many awards during his career, including a Presidential Rank Award for Meritorious Service for Senior Executives in 2009. Our third speaker is Jimmy Bramblett, and he is Chief of Staff for the Regional Conservationists at USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service. Jimmy began his career with NRCS in 1990 in Georgia. He has served in a number of positions at NRCS. In addition to his career with NRCS, Jimmy has served for 12 years as an adjunct faculty research scientist with the University of Georgia in the College of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences, conducting economic research on water quality and water quality modeling. Our fourth speaker is Steve Hopkins. He is the Non-Point Source Coordinator at Iowa Department of Natural Resources. Steve has worked in the Section 319 Non-Point Source program since 2007, and he has worked closely with NRCS in Iowa on the National Water Quality Initiative. He has worked for Iowa's DNR since 2000 in the drinking water and on-site wastewater programs, and previously worked as a county sanitarian, watershed project coordinator, and farmer. Our final speaker, John Hubert, is the acting state conservationist at USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service in Iowa. He has been involved with the management of water quality initiatives as well as the implementation of water quality practices in both NRCS and EPA-funded projects. His experience includes 1.5 years in Iowa and 25 years in Illinois. As you see from the slide, we're going to hear from Linda first, an overview of water quality issues in our Clean Water Act 319 program. We're going to hear from Tom and Jimmy about the National Water Quality Initiative in fiscal year 12 and hopefully for the future. And we're going to hear about Iowa's experience in implementing the National Water Quality Initiative in fiscal year 12. And one final note before we get started with our first speaker, we will try to answer as many questions as possible throughout the webcast. However, due to the high volume of participants, not all questions will be answered. In the event that your question is not answered, please feel free to contact the speakers after the webcast. You can access the speaker's contact information on one of our final slides for today's webcast. So with that, we will begin our webcast. Our first speaker is Linda Hall. She is Chief of the Non-Point Source Control Branch at US EPA. Linda, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Okay. Thank you, Ann, and hello, everyone. Well, as Ann said, I'm going to just provide a little bit of context here for a few minutes in terms of some of the challenges that we face nationally with non-point source pollution, including contributions from agriculture, and talk about how the EPA Clean Water Act Section 319 program is structured to help address some of those challenges, and also strike the theme that why it's so important for us to collaborate with our agricultural partners in addressing some of these challenges, and how we view the USDA National Water Quality Initiative as an excellent opportunity for getting better water quality outcomes by working together. So to start, I'm going to provide just a little bit of context on the national scope of nutrient pollution, nitrogen and phosphorus pollution. This is not the only kind of non-point source pollution, of course. The 319 program and state non-point source programs deal with sediments, pathogens, metals, all kinds of other types of non-point source pollution, but few pollutants are as pervasive and challenging to manage as excess nitrogen and phosphorus, and so it's a very important area of emphasis for EPA and the states right now. And this slide helps to illustrate, just in a partial way, the magnitude of the problem that we face. States have listed more than 15,000 nutrient-related impaired waters. You can see the figures here in terms of what that means in terms of miles and acres. And I'll just note that there's good reason to believe that this is an underestimate, probably by a significant amount, without getting into details why that is. But even with these numbers, obviously a very significant number of nutrient-polluted waters. Associated with that, there are more than 8,000 nutrient-related TMDLs, or total maximum daily loads, that have been completed to date. Those TMDLs haven't necessarily been implemented to correct the problems, but those analyses have been done to identify what pollutant load reductions would be needed to meet the water quality goals in those areas. So additional sources of information that we have at EPA provide additional context on the scale of the nutrient problem. We have done a number of probabilistic national water quality surveys that add to and amend the data that we get from states on the quality of their waters based on their own assessments. And these next two bullets are from these national surveys, which report that approximately half of assessed streams have medium to high levels of nitrogen and phosphorus, and more than 40% of lakes meet those levels. And then a couple final figures, 78% of continental U.S. coastal waters exhibit eutrophication. For some of you that may not be familiar with that term, it's basically a condition in which oxygen levels in the water have become quite low due to excess growth of algae, and the algae is feeding on excess levels of nutrients in the water. If oxygen levels get low enough, below 2 milligrams per liter, it goes beyond eutrophication and is called what's called a hypoxic zone, very low oxygen level, and there are 168 hypoxic zones that have been identified in U.S. waters. So clearly, we have a significant national problem with nutrient levels. And this slide takes a little deeper look at some of the data that we have, and also identifies the contributions from agricultural non-point sources to the nutrient, to the pollution picture that's presented here. So this data comes from state reports to EPA. These reports happen biennially under 305B and Section 305B and 303D of the Clean Water Act. States assess their waters and then report to EPA on those that meet the water quality standards that a state has identified, that beneficial uses of swimming, fishing, and so on, drinking water, and then identify those waters that don't meet those standards. And because resources are always limited for monitoring, states aren't able to assess all of their waters. And so this pie chart illustrates that of all the, in this case, rivers and streams, rivers and stream miles, states were able to assess about 27% of those. And then looking at the second pie chart, of the 27% assessed, just over half of those were impaired and about 46% in good shape. And so states further identify, as part of this report, the known, where it is known, the sources of impairment for the waters that end up on this list. And agricultural sources do feature prominently in all of those lists. So they're the #1 source for rivers and streams, #3 source for lakes, ponds, and reservoirs, and #9 source for estuaries. And this table is a different way of showing the data, but it also gives you some context here on some of the other sources of impairment that the states have identified, in this case in the 2010 reporting cycle. So agricultural sources dominate. They're certainly not alone. We have challenges with atmospheric deposition and several other causes here. But clearly we know in nutrients in particular, we have a big challenge, and we know that agricultural sources do dominate there. So what tools do we have to address that challenge? Although agriculture is identified here as a one word, we know agriculture is not a monolith, that it integrates the activities over millions of acres and thousands of different landowners. And so it's a distributed issue, and under the Clean Water Act, under the federal regulations, we take primarily a voluntary approach to addressing this issue, with the exception of a very relatively small number of facilities known as concentrated animal feeding operations. So in the Federal Clean Water Act, the 319 program is the primary program for addressing all non-point sources of pollution. And I'm going to spend now a couple minutes just telling you a little bit of background about 319 and how it works, and then that will help us understand how we can integrate better with NRCS's conservation program. So 319 provides grants to states and tribes for technical and financial assistance and other activities described here. We have done many, many projects focusing on agriculture under 319, especially on nutrients and pathogens, and many of them are coordinated already with USDA conservation programs. A number of states have very good working relationships between the water quality agencies and the state conservationist office. So those relationships are in place in some places, and we hope to expand them through the National Water Quality Initiative. One of the major measures we use to gauge our progress in the 319 program is we refer to as success stories. And I mentioned before that states report to EPA on waters that don't meet water quality standards, and once they report those waters, they're on a list. It's called the 303D list. And one of our success measures is projects that have been successful enough to remove waters from that list to meet by meeting water quality standards. I'll talk a little bit more about how we gauge those successes in a minute. But 319 funding can be used to provide staffing support at state and local levels, planning, technical assistance. It can fund on-the-ground BMPs, conservation practices, monitoring, and of course partnership building, which is extremely essential to success of non-point source projects on the ground. So here are some data on the funding levels for 319. You can see these numbers are not going in the right direction. The non-point source pollution problems continue to grow through increased population and land use changes, and our funding has not only not grown, but it's going down, kind of consistent with many other federal programs in these tight times. So we definitely have a challenge there. And it's why leveraging with our partners, one reason why leveraging with our partners is so important. But these funds go, for the most part, directly to states through an allocation formula that is in the EPA 319 guidelines. The states match this amount with an additional 40% of funds to the 60% federal. So that does significantly grow the pot of money that's available for non-point source projects. And historically, we've identified 319 funds as either base or incremental funds. Incremental funds are used to develop, implement, and monitor watershed projects to address non-point sources of pollution. And the base funds can be used for a wide range of activities listed here. And I've bolded partnership building and leveraging because that is so important to the success of these projects on the ground, both because of the resources, but also because of the skills and enthusiasm and commitment that other partners can bring. And so that's a great segue to this slide, which notes the common goals that 319 and the USDA conservation programs have. Our programs are complementary and can work quite well together. We have evidence of that. They're voluntary programs that are fueled by partnership at the local levels. And we do, although we have distinct goals, we have quite a bit of overlap in our goals as well. And I think we can build from there. As I noted, there are a number of states that have active and ongoing collaborations between the state water quality agencies and the state conservationist office. And to the extent that funding consideration is given to the state's non-point source priority pollutants or watersheds or other criteria, when the state conservation is making a decision, those are taken into consideration. In the other states, relationships may not be as well established, and as I said, I think the National Water Quality Initiative, both this year and the one we will be shaping jointly with USDA in FY13, is a fantastic opportunity to deliver more results where that coordination is already going on, and then to help get that coordination going in more states. And as a testament to how powerful it can be when our programs do work together, I mentioned our non-point source success stories, and there are 370 of them so far, and nearly 30% of those involved collaboration with USDA programs. Sorry, I just rushed through that slide. This is the link to the non-point source success stories. If anyone would like to go take a look at them, they're organized by state, and they're one page each. They're pretty interesting just to skim through if you're interested in taking a look at a couple of those, especially from your own area. I wanted to spend just a minute talking about the common attributes we've seen among these 370 non-point source success stories, because again, I think they are informative in terms of how these efforts can work very well with the NRCS conservation programs. So what we have seen through these successes is that a specific non-point source problem areas and practices were identified, and then projects implemented to address those areas. So through either watershed-based plan or a TMDL, there was some sense of what were the so-called critical areas in the watershed, the places where conservation practices or BMPs would have the greatest impact or a more significant impact for water quality benefit. All areas in a watershed aren't created equal, and a very important function of planning and doing some upfront analysis is that we're much better informed about where practices will have the greatest effect. Nearly all the success stories were funded by 319, and all of them involved multiple project partners that were providing resources, expertise, elbow grease, reaching out to landowners, and lots of other ways to make these projects successful. Local buy-in was a necessary ingredient as well, and often the project partners helped to get that. And then these last 2 points are important, which is these efforts take time. The impairments don't happen overnight, and the repairs don't happen overnight either. And so you really need partners that will hang in there with you for a few years and get the job done. And then, of course, you need monitoring data to document the improvement. So segueing to the FY12 National Water Quality Initiative, you're going to hear a lot from Tom and Jimmy about this in a minute. I'll just say some of the features I've flagged here, some of the features we found particularly notable and very exciting, which is that the NRCS National Bulletin, which you'll hear more about, that's basically the headquarters instructions to the state conservationists, were that these investments were to focus on water quality results in high priority impaired waters. A focus was on nutrient and sediment impairments, and the initiative would select 1 to 3 watersheds per state, and to make that selection based on taking into consideration input from the State Water Quality Agency. And this year, 5% of EQIP funds were used, and as Ann said, that was $33 million. And so looking ahead to FY13, we're very excited. We're extremely pleased that USDA moved out ahead this year with the National Water Quality Initiative. In FY13, it is a joint initiative with EPA, and so we'll be very pleased to work with USDA to get ready to launch that initiative in just a couple short months. And the basic outline is that USDA will continue the investment of EQIP funds in targeted watersheds, and again, you'll hear a lot more about it. And then EPA and states on the 319 or Water Quality Agency side will provide monitoring support to gauge the water quality results so that we can see the progress we're making as time goes on. So with that, my remarks are over, and we have time for a couple of questions.
Great, thanks for that, Linda. Really a terrific overview, and now we will be taking some questions for a few minutes. And the first question is, I'm wondering what are some of the primary ways that 319 funds might be used to complement NRCS's National Water Quality Initiative?
Sure. There are a number of potential ways, and I guess I'll just say by way of context, state non-point source programs vary widely, and so one of the great strengths of 319 funds is that they can be used by states in a variety of different ways. So I'll just give a couple examples, but know that this isn't exhaustive. So one way 319 funds could be used is the development of that watershed-based plan I mentioned to identify areas within a watershed that what the pollutant loads are in that area, what practices might most effectively address those loads to get to water quality goals. So that's one important thing that 319 funding can provide. 319 also can be used to fund local watershed coordinators. Often these are regional or local conservation district staff or local NGO staff, and they work within the watershed to coordinate all the activities that need to happen for projects to go forward and the goals of the watershed-based plan to be realized. So they could help, for example, doing outreach to landowners if that was useful, to gauge interest in putting conservation practices on the land, help convene meetings of stakeholders to make plans to move forward and that kind of thing. So, and then as I mentioned, as part of the implementation of 319 projects, there is a monitoring component to gauge the results of that, and so that's another potential use of 319 funds, of course, for the National Water Quality Initiative.
Okay, so that's good. So the monitoring component is a national effort. Do the states have any way to shape that, or individual project applicants have any way to shape the monitoring component?
The design of the monitoring component itself, I think, is a fairly complex topic and probably too complex to get into here. But we are having conversations, we will be having conversations with the states and with USDA about what the monitoring component looks like for this effort. We want to make sure it's an efficient use of monitoring resources and that we're doing the monitoring where we would expect to see water quality results. And so there are a number of considerations that will go into the design and execution of the monitoring component that we'll be having a lot of dialogue about going forward over these next few months.
Fair enough. Now, one of the participants asked the question, can National Water Quality Initiative funds be used as match for 319 projects, so matching federal to federal?
No. No, federal funds cannot be used as match.
Okay, so the match has to come from non-federal sources.
That's correct.
Okay, terrific. We've cleared that up. I know you had listed that some of the causes of nutrient impairments are just unknown. Do you have sort of an idea of what some of the possible causes behind the unknown categorization might stem from?
I would hesitate to speculate on that. That information is rolled up to a national level from reports by 50 different states, and there could be a variety of reasons why a state might not feel confident in listing a specific source for a particular impairment on a particular lake or stream, et cetera. So I don't think I'd want to hazard a guess on that.
Okay, very good. I understand that the 319 program is undergoing some changes and that EPA will be issuing updated guidelines for future 319 grants under the Clean Water Act. And I'm just wondering how ag projects might be affected in ways that they weren't in the past.
I don't anticipate any significant changes to the type or the substance or the number of agriculture-related projects that could be undertaken under the new revised 319 guidelines versus under the current guidelines. Many of the 319 program reforms focus on 319 program management and accountability and our ability to deliver and describe results. They don't fundamentally change the way projects can be designed and executed on the ground. So I think states will have a lot of flexibility going forward to design these projects in a way that makes sense for them.
Okay, terrific. So there's still that flexibility that we're anticipating. And while we did get a few other questions that have come in, it feels to me like those questions are probably more appropriate for NRCS to respond to. So with that, I'm ready to move on with this segment.
Okay, thank you, Don and Linda. Thank you for those great answers. And our next speaker is Tom Christensen of USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service. Take it away, Tom.
Thank you, Ann. I appreciate this opportunity and really appreciate EPA's partnership on this initiative in fiscal year 2012. I think as many of you might know, we did work closely with EPA at the national level. and then through our state conservationists worked with the state water quality agencies in the process to select the local watersheds. At EPA, I'd really like to thank Linda Hall, Tom Wall, and Katie Flayhive. Those were the individuals we worked very closely with during the development phase. And then here at NRCS, Jimmy Bramblett, who was the senior advisor to our internal NRCS team, which consisted of state level and national level specialists. So thank you very much to all those folks that helped to get this off the ground. I'm going to go to the next slide here, and I want to present at a high-cut level our partnership challenge as I view it. I think you all recognize that we're going to continue to have population growth of a significant degree. And what you may not realize, though, is the loss of agricultural land, particularly cropland, that has occurred in the last few decades. And here you see the statistics on that. 63 million acres of cropland were lost in a 25-year period from 1982 to 2007. So we have this challenge of increasing demand for food, which is not going to go away, which means more intense land use because we have to produce more out of the acres that remain. And so there is our biggest challenge, that we have to produce safe food, we have to produce a lot of food, and at the same time we desire these conservation values of healthy soil, clean water, clean air, etc. We think we have some of the answers to this challenge, but certainly there's some innovation yet to be developed and technical requirements and standards, but the challenge lies in implementation. Let me show you this next slide. What this is from is our National Resources Inventory, and it's taking a look at urbanization in this country in the year 1982. So the darker colors represent the density of urbanization. The orange, the dark orange, is more dense. Even the greens represent some level of urbanization. And if we go to the next slide, which is 2007, you see the dramatic loss of agricultural land that occurred in that 25-year period, what I referenced earlier. And just to throw another statistic at you, 1/3 of all the land that was developed in the United States was developed in that 25-year period between 1982 and 2007. So again, what this tells us, if we're going to produce more food and we're going to produce high-quality food, the land that's going to be producing it is going to be doing it in a more intense way, and therefore we have to be even more cognizant of the conservation measures that we want to apply in those lands. Another view at the priority resource concerns was taken through something called our resource conservation appraisal. This is something we do at the direction of Congress about every 5 years. The last one was completed a couple of years ago, and this particular slide represents the information through surveys with the state technical committees that advise our state conservationists, and then also the local working groups, which are components of the state technical committee. And the thing I want to point out here is if you look at the far left, you see water, sediment, and nutrients, and then in the middle of the slide you see soil erosion. Generally, when we're thinking of water quality, and especially in the context of this initiative, those are the issues we're talking about. And you can see that those are still significant issues recognized at both the state technical committee level and certainly the local working group level. One of the things that we've recognized in USDA and especially in NRCS is the need to better assess the effect of the conservation work that has taken place and then therefore identify the remaining conservation needs that are out there. And one of those projects is called the Conservation Effects Assessment Project, CEAP. This has been underway since about 2003. Some of the key findings so far on our regional cropland assessments are displayed on this slide. One of the points I'll make is that we view the glass as half full, not half empty. In other words, voluntary conservation is achieving results, and if we did not have that conservation in place, we would see a lot greater environmental impacts. But we also know there's an opportunity to further reduce sediment and nutrient losses through a systems approach supported by conservation planning. We also know that targeting is a key piece of the answer to this equation, and targeting the right system of practices on the right landscape is the ultimate answer to getting the kinds of results that we all desire. Again, I mentioned this CEAP project was initiated in 2003, so not only does it have the cropland assessment piece, but it has many other components that are basically painting a picture of the effects of the conservation that's on the ground in this country and then the further needs that are out there. Back to the cropland assessment piece, what you'll see on this slide is a map representing the United States and the major watersheds. The watersheds shown in yellow are the ones where we have completed the SEEP cropland assessment reports, and those have been released. The Missouri River Basin, which is outlined in red, is the next one which is ready for release very shortly. But these are monumental pieces for us because they do talk to the effects of conservation practices on cropland. Here's a look at the 4 major watersheds where we have completed the SEEP cropland assessment: the Upper Mississippi, the Chesapeake Bay, the Great Lakes, and the Ohio, Tennessee. There's a couple of things I want to point out on this slide. The red represents the percentage of cropland that still has a need for high conservation treatment levels. The blue represents the percentage of the cropland acres that have moderate treatment level needs. So the good part of the answer here is, or the positive part is that the high treatment acres generally tend to be 20% or less of those watersheds. The part that is still a significant challenge is we still see a lot of acres that even need moderate treatment. So in total, we know there's a lot of acres out there that still need some level of conservation treatment, and some of those acres, it's a very high level of treatment that's needed. The next 2 slides, this first one is on phosphorus, and the next one is on nitrogen, try to get at the issue in a very elementary fashion regarding what we call the 4 R's in applying nutrients: the right rate, the right timing, the right method, and the right placement. Now this slide only talks to 3 of those: the right rate, the right timing, and the right method. And I want to refer you to the 4th line down where it says appropriate rate and timing and method. So that's the combination of those 3 very important things. And what this slide is telling us that in these major watersheds, somewhere between 20 and 30% of the producers are applying those 3 things in what we would consider the best fashion. So what that shows us is we still have a significant challenge in getting the 4 R's applied properly on cropland. And that's still one of the frontiers, one of the challenges for us as a conservation community. If I go to the next slide, you'll see that it's even a bit of a more challenge when it comes to nitrogen. Again, going down to the 4th line across and looking at the combination of rate, timing, and method, those are the percentages of producers that are applying those combination of practices the way we would envision them. So one of the tools we've used in USDA and NRCS to try to be more effective with the conservation dollars that we are afforded is the establishment of landscape conservation initiatives. And these started about 3 years ago in most cases under the direction of our chief, Dave White. And there's a number of reasons we pursued this. Obviously, we know that targeting can be more effective. It can also, I think, stimulate local efforts and partnerships on a watershed scale. And it's certainly easier to begin to evaluate performance and environmental outcomes when you're dealing on a watershed basis versus random acts of conservation. This map shows a depiction of our active landscape conservation initiatives across the country. Many of these are water-based. Many of them are water quality-based, such as MRBI in Chesapeake Bay, the Great Lakes, which is funded by EPA. But also many of these are species-oriented, wildlife habitat, etc. So we do have quite a variety of initiatives, but they all follow the same principle of trying to target the right practices on the right acres. A couple of key features of our approach to implementation. Technical assistance is so important to this because you have to have technical assistance to support outreach, to facilitate planning, to develop the contracts and agreements, and it has to be trusted and competent technical assistance. NRCS is certainly not the only source of that. There are state agencies, districts, private sector individuals, but I can't stress enough the importance of technical assistance. Another key element is dedicated funding. We've been fortunate through the last few farm bills to have a significant amount of dollars that we can provide for cost-sharing assistance, and the dedicated funding helps us to accelerate it when we're using it in a small watershed. One of the things, too, is when we're looking at these priority watersheds, we're not only doing the targeting of dollars to the watershed, but we're also targeting the dollars within that watershed based on the priority resource concerns, based on our application and ranking system, and based on the suites of practices that we provide for cost sharing. In addition, in some of these projects, we're combining the use of easements in our working land programs, such as EQIP. And in these initiatives also, we're coordinating our sign-up periods across the states to generate focus and hopefully greater interest in participating. In addition, partners are so key to these watershed-based projects. They're the ones that can help do the outreach and generate the interest of private landowners. Obviously, we're very interested in consistency across state boundaries because we're dealing with a watershed, and water doesn't care about state boundaries, and we want conservation applied consistently. In addition, we've tried to move toward shorter-term contracts so we can accelerate implementation, remove some of the variables that prevent implementation over the longer term. And, of course, we've instituted a suite of things related to performance and outcome expectations with these initiatives. So most central to all of this effort that we're talking about, once we have established these projects, is conservation planning. This is really nothing more than a decision-making process for that landowner, and it's our responsibility to bring them the right technical information, the right alternatives, including economic information, so that hopefully they're making the right decisions with their land that will have a positive impact on environmental issues, including water quality. And what we're trying to do through that conservation planning process is establish a conservation system. This is the right combination of practices on the right position on the landscape and the right amount. And oftentimes, too, you have to sequence the implementation of these practices, sometimes over multiple years. But the bottom line is I can't stress enough the importance of a systems approach to conservation, not practice by practice. I'm going to transition now to Jimmy Bramlett on this last slide here. But as Linda mentioned, the President's budget has established an expectation for 2013 that we continue this coordination and collaboration with EPA and other agencies that are very much interested in water quality. So we believe that through 2012, we'll gain the value of some lessons learned that will be very instrumental in the improvement of this effort for 2013. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jimmy Bramlett.
All right, thanks, Tom. And what I'm going to do is kind of follow a little bit of the information that we've all talked about up to this particular point. That is, we talked about general principles about why we're doing what we're doing with the National Water Quality Initiative inside USDA. I'm going to give you a little bit of a sense of how we actually did it from the outset this year, and then try to leave you with an impartation of the vision of what we have for the water quality modeling and monitoring into the future. And then we have a pretty good example from Iowa that will follow us up to show you in detail exactly how we try to do this. But as we've talked about up to this point, we really wanted to accelerate our funding in the 12-digit watersheds. And just in case anybody doesn't have a good handle on what a 12-digit watershed, they average in size from 10,000 acres up to 40,000 acres. And for those of you that are familiar with the District of Columbia, it's 39,000 acres. So that's about the size of the watershed that we're talking about with respect to focusing these funds and looking specifically at 4 types of water bodies. One, a water body that's impaired, which means it's on the 303D list. Second is a water body that's threatened, which means that it's working its way to be listed on the 303D list. Third is a water body that has a TMDL plan in place because of being listed on the 303D list. And fourth is what we call a critical water body. And if you think about a watershed and you have some smaller segmented water sheds upstream of a listed water or a threatened water or a TMDL watershed, this is the watershed that may be making the major contribution to the impairment downstream. So those were the 4 types of water bodies that we focused on with this accelerated funding and the geographic scale that we were looking at when we tried to focus on dedicating these funds. We We've already mentioned that we wanted to try to address agricultural sources. We chose nutrients and sediments this year because we wanted to get rid of what we were calling the low-hanging fruit, so to speak. And I think Linda mentioned in her outset introduction that we had no less than 1 watershed per state, but no more than 3 watersheds per state. That was the initial guidance that we gave to some of our states, to all of our states, but some of them came back and said, you know, we need an exception from the regional conservationists because our watersheds are large, or the 12 digits are the same size, but the landscapes are vast and the landowners are large, thinking in terms particularly out west where you have relatively few ranchers over a 40,000 acre segment. So we did have some exceptions there. And of course the overall goal is to try to remove streams from the 303D list or to prevent others from ever being listed in the first place. The pollutants, I'll just mention this again real quick, nutrients and sediment. On the left-hand side of the screen, you see the various forms of the nutrients that were manifested on 303D list that we saw across the country. I'll just note that many of the correlating pollutants, so pesticides, temperature, and other ag-related pollutants were also in these watersheds as well. We talked a little bit about the process. We gave our state conservationists a charge to work first and foremost with the state water quality agencies. And then with that collaboration, they in turn would go and visit with their state technical committees. And for any of you that may not be aware, a state technical committee is a interdisciplinary, interagency organization that is mandated by a federal rule to help state conservationists make decisions with respect to Farm Bill implementation. So they were part of the consultation process and the recommendations that were given to state conservationists. The state conservationists made the final decision and then passed that decision up to the regional conservationists for concurrence in that way that and for the selection process. The systems approach that we talked about earlier, we had core and supporting practices. The core and supporting practices were practices that were identified by pollutants. So for example, we know that nutrient management has a positive impact on nutrient losses at the edge of field. And so we had a matrix of all of our 165 conservation practices and the specific pollutants that they address. In addition to that, there are supporting practices like an edge of field border that would support that core practice. And what we encouraged through our ranking process was that applicants sign up and work to apply core and supporting practices, which we call a systems approach to conservation practices. In addition to that, we had 5 conservation activity plans. These are plans that take a more strategic look at the different types of issues on farms, nutrient management, pest management, irrigation management, and the like. We have typically with our conservation programs far more demand than we have supply. That is, far more demand for the dollars that we have in relation to the dollars we have to fund projects for. So we do a 2-step approach in trying to select applicants with whom we develop conservation plans and contracts for conservation practice implementation. The first step is to screen applicants. And we have a high, medium, and low category. And the idea here is that applicants in the high category will be ranked first before we ever move into ranking applicants in the medium category. And this slide gives you a sense of what it takes to be an applicant in the high category. We wanted someone that did have a core set of conservation practices, that all the practices would be in the watershed, and the core set of those practices would be on at least 25% of the acres within the application area. Once we screened all the applicants from high, medium, and low, we moved on to ranking those, particularly those in the high category first. And I'm not aware that we actually ever made it to the medium category to rank any of those applications. But the ranking process includes 3 sets of questions: national questions, state questions, and local questions. And the national questions account for 25% of the ranking score. The state questions account for 50% of the ranking score, and local questions count for 25% of the ranking score as well. You can see on this slide that the national questions are the same. They're the same throughout the country, and that is for consistency, whether it's the National Water Quality Initiative, our air quality initiative, our general EQIP funding pool. The national questions are consistent across the country. State questions for most programs and most initiatives are generated at the state level. But in the case of the National Water Quality Initiative, we generated the state questions at the national office, again, with a desire and an eye toward consistency. And we wanted to make sure that those questions were helping address some of the resource issues and concerns that we've spoke about earlier in this webcast. The local questions in the National Water Quality Initiative were developed at the state level, and they were developed, again, in consultation with the State Technical Committee. For the National Water Quality Initiative, I mentioned earlier that we have a suite of 165 conservation practices. Not all of those conservation practices have an impact on water quality. And so we did identify which of those water quality or which of those conservation practices do have an impact on water quality. And then we also had a regionalization of our payment schedule. And the reason that we do a regionalization of our payment schedule, and this is the amount of money we would pay to an individual landowner for a specific practice. The reason we do the regionalization is for the purpose of consistency again. If we have too much variation out there, we find a situation where one state might be paying more for the same practice compared to a different state, and that raises questions about the efficiency of the work we're doing and the government's intent to have a low-cost approach to addressing resource concerns. There were a few occasions, and we did allow some waivers where individuals and states, or rather states, made a request to the regional conservationists and our deputy chief of programs to have a modification to these practices. A few of those were granted, but not all. This next slide here shows the time frame that we started the program and that we implemented the program. You can see here we began with our coordination at EPA in February 23rd. We actually had a team develop the guidance from the middle part of January to the middle part of February. So all of the information that we were doing and trying to accomplish and implement this year was done within a 4-week period. After that, we began our coordination with EPA, OMB, the Department of Agriculture, and many others to implement the program. Through April, we gave our states an opportunity to work with their state water quality agencies, select their watersheds, and make their recommendations about those selected watersheds back to the Regional Conservationist Office. We went out with a public announcement on May the 8th, invited individuals within these targeted watersheds and selected watersheds and approved watersheds, invited these individuals to come into our field offices and sign up to participate in the National Water Quality Initiative. We had 2 cutoff periods, the last of which was June the 15th, and then just last week we had our obligation deadline. Now, very quickly, the obligation deadline being 2 weeks after the application deadline is a little bit of a tight time period. What happens with our field office is they give them 2 weeks to develop a conservation plan and also develop a set of contracting documents and then round landowners up for signatures and approvals before we can actually complete the obligation process. So even as of today, we're not 100% complete with these obligations, but we're nearing that 100% mark. And then the last bullet on this slide has to do with outcome training. It's something that we probably are most excited about with this National Water Quality Initiative, and I've got several slides dedicated to this, and so I'll talk about this a little further into the webcast. This slide right here is a picture. It's not intended to be read. It's a picture to illustrate the collaboration that we've had in this whole initiative. It basically is a listing of 303D listings for sediment and nutrient by watershed, by state across the country. It's actually a very massive database. And then in addition to this, there's also a set of data from USGS, which includes nutrient and sediment loadings by watershed from the Sparrow model. So on the one side, we have the problems within a watershed as identified by water quality modeling. And on the other side of this watershed, we have the potential loading by watershed from water quality modeling. I said modeling on the 303D list, that's monitoring. and then the sparrow loadings were based off of modeling. This information basically was used by state conservationists, state technical committees, state water quality agencies to help select which watershed they would pursue for this initiative. In the end, there were 162 watersheds submitted. 5 of these watersheds were rejected because they were not either a watershed that included the criteria that we were looking for or the pollutants that we were looking for. And we had 157 that were approved. On average, there were 3 watersheds per state, ranging from 1, which was the minimum, and you might recall me mentioning that in a few cases we would go up to 7 watersheds, or above 3 with regional conservationist approval, and Texas had 7 watersheds. Of these 157, 137 of those were on the 303D list, or contained 303D listed water bodies. This map here shows the watersheds, the scale of which is very difficult to see because, again, we're showing you a national map, and we're talking about an area no larger than the District of Columbia. And so we have a couple of examples just to kind of help put this in perspective. The first one is in Texas, and keep in mind that the highlighted watersheds are the 7 watersheds that were selected. And to put that in a little bit of a scale, you can see north of this project area is the Dallas and Fort Worth Metroplex. So 7 40,000-acre watersheds right there. This could be up to about a 250 or 280,000-acre project area in the state of Texas. And another example, just again to try to put the scale in context, is from South Dakota. On the right-hand side, you can see the state of South Dakota. You can see their selected watersheds. And in the larger map, you can see how it covers just a portion of 4 counties there. A few more statistics here about the watersheds that were selected. We have 128 of those 157 currently have water quality monitoring stations there. 82 of them have 319 projects. 68 of them have our landscape conservation initiatives like the Mississippi River Basin, or the Great Lakes Restoration Area, or the Chesapeake Bay. And then 27 of those 157 have all 3 of those combined. As Linda mentioned at the outset, we've dedicated $33 million to this effort. This slide shows the breakdown by state and the investment by state. The state conservationists were given the opportunity to add to the 5% that they were required of their allocation, original allocation. They were given the opportunity to add to that, and several states did do that, but they were not given the opportunity to take away from those funds. So if they were not able to use all the money allocated to their state, they were instructed to return those funds so we could redirect those to other states where the National Water Quality Initiative funding was needed. And we have had states request additional funding for the National Water Quality Initiative. The following slide here talks about 319 and the collaboration that was mentioned earlier. These are just some specifics. We are aware of $19 million in those watersheds that there's a combination of National Water Quality Initiative and 319 projects. 2.3 million of that 19 million is for monitoring, 11 million is for financial assistance, similar to the $33 million that we put into those watersheds for financial assistance. And then there's $5.6 million there dedicated to technical assistance. So that gives you a perspective of how we actually tried to implement the concepts that we've talked about to this point. I want to turn now to the future and talk a little bit about what we expect as far as outcomes. How are we going to articulate the good things we're doing with this collaboration, with the financial investment, with the human capital investment? We're going to do it in a variety of, using a variety of tools. And from the NRCS perspective, the first one we'll talk about is the Water Quality Index for Agriculture, WQI for Ag. I mentioned earlier that we had 3 watersheds per state on average participating in this National Water Quality Initiative. What we've asked our states is to identify one of those watersheds that we could infiltrate using this water quality index for agriculture to assess the potential improvements for water quality. Apex, which is a water quality modeling tool that has heretofore been used at the 4-digit HUC level. So if you think in terms of a 12-digit HUC being 40,000 acres, a 4-digit HUC is multi-state. We're working to try to make this a statistically significant tool that can assess water quality, and by water quality modeling at the 12-digit watershed level. And then finally, we're looking at implementing some water quality monitoring ourselves, which is relatively new for NRCS. We're looking actually at a 3-tiered approach in doing this. One is edge of field. Second is working with partners for in-stream. And then the third tier is what we call the pour point, or the terminus of the watershed, or where the water flows at the outlet of the watershed. So let me make just a couple of comments here about the water quality index for agriculture. It is a qualitative, not a quantitative, but it is a qualitative multivariate metric. Now, even though it's qualitative, it does have a number. And this is what it's telling you. It is an index. It's a water quality index. And the easiest way to think of this is if 10 means good, and that's the best you can get, then 4 gives you a reference of where you are in your particular field as to where you can be on that particular field, given a variety of components that I'll mention in just a moment. But the purpose and the benefits associated with this tool is that it can help us assess conservation implementation over time and evaluate the effectiveness of conservation practices. Linda mentioned earlier one of the challenges with water quality monitoring is the temporal aspect of it. A lot of times activities happen upstream in a watershed, and it takes time before those improvements pass through a water quality monitoring station downstream. And at the same time, there are so many variables taking place that it's often difficult to pinpoint and to track exactly where the issues and opportunities are arising from. We do not claim that this is a panacea for all water quality. It's not a substitute for monitoring. It's not a substitute for actual water quality measurements, but it is a cost-effective and easy-to-use tool that can be used in every field on which a conservation practice has been installed. Here are the components that I referenced earlier that basically relate to the physical factors associated with a field, which include the soil factors like our slope, our K factor, our organic matter content. We can look at climatic information as well as vegetation. And then we also get into the management aspects of it. So we look at the nutrient management factors, the tillage management factors, pest management, and some of the irrigation. And from there, we can develop this index that gives us a score of 0 to 10. And this slide right here basically shows you just a snapshot of the fact that it is an internet database. And in this particular case, you can see that it is red down at the bottom. Red meaning it's something that could go for improvement. And you can see the different categories starting at the top being our components, being the field physical sensitivity factors, and then as you work your way down through there, you get into the other management activities. Again, it's subjective. It is based off of a lot of science, but it is applied by a number of individuals across the landscape that do have to use professional experience to integrate what those factors happen to be, combine those components, and then apply a weighting scheme in order to develop this index and to interpret that it is correct. It is one tool. It's not perfect, but when used in combination with the other tools, we're going to be able to vastly improve that and have a lot more confidence in 2, 3, 5 years down the road with the quality of information that we get out of this water quality index for agriculture. The second tool is Apex, and I mentioned that heretofore we've used it to do statistically significant sampling at a very large scale, and we talked earlier about SEEP. This slide shows DEEP, that should be SEEP. It's used basically to assess our conservation evaluation and assessment program and assess the effectiveness of conservation practices. One of the things that makes this model unique is the fact that it's done not only in conjunction with what is observed by the modeler, but it's done in conjunction with what's reported as far as management activities through a fairly intensive survey by the landowner or the farm manager themselves. We use this on our National Resource Inventory sampling points. And just as a quick qualifier in case anyone's not familiar with our National Resource Inventory program, Congress has mandated that NRCS report on a 5-year basis the condition of our land. And this is the program and the tool that we use that has spatially referenced and statistically significantly referenced sampling points. And in a 12-digit watershed, we're talking about 800 different points that would be looked at and be measured for this particular purpose. We're using this basically to characterize watersheds, principally in the Mississippi River Basin, and it's also going to be designed to complement the monitoring side of this equation. So we've talked about the Water Quality Index for agriculture. We've talked about APEX as a modeling approach. Now we want to introduce and talk a little bit about our monitoring efforts. I mentioned at the beginning it's a 3-tiered approach where we're trying to look at edge of field and combine edge of field monitoring with in-stream monitoring, and then also have those spatially referenced with the pour point or the watershed scale monitoring. And so the big excitement we have here is the fact that this is what we're seeing is the first time where other agencies are working with us to actually identify the conservation practices that are on the ground, being put on the ground, look at the water quality coming off the land associated with those conservation practices, measure that in relation to water quality from an ambient water quality monitoring station in stream within the watershed somewhere, and then also cross-reference that, all three together, with the watershed level of the pour point monitoring downstream. So we're excited about this, but we also have some limitations. What we can do is we can cost share with the producers for the edge of field monitoring, but these are fairly expensive systems, and so we need partners to help work and help defray some of the non-federal costs associated with this, and also to help us manage the and monitor the other water quality activities within the watershed. NRCS does not do in-stream watering, water quality monitoring, nor do we do watershed level monitoring, and so it's going to take that partnership approach in order to make the linkage I described earlier become a reality. This slide shows you a little bit about just an example of what the water quality edge of field monitoring station might look like. In addition to try to use this information for improving our water quality index for agriculture at the field scale, and also for having a better understanding about what's coming off of an edge of field in relation to in-stream water quality monitoring, the nice additional benefit we get is the fact that we can inform the landowner about the activities that they're putting on the land and how to better manage their farm. We call that adaptive management. And it's one of the key aspects of trying to help improve water quality at the field scale level. We've got the Mississippi River Basin basically as our large watershed scale pilot area in which we're working to do this. We are working with other partners to target some of the watersheds within the Mississippi River Basin, and to do this 3-tiered monitoring approach, again looking at nutrient, sediment, land use, conservation activities, and trends. We're excited about the fact that not only will these be linked together, but the opportunity for the longitudinal or the temporal or the time frame aspect with which we'll be able to track a lot of this information as well. This will help us develop a geospatial database of water quality at varying scales, and then also make better decisions on how to improve water quality at those scales. We currently have a variety of teams that are identifying those gaps within the Mississippi River Basin. They're looking at the monitoring needs that we have, things we haven't had to deal with and think about before, such as who collects data, how do we manage that data, how do we amalgamate that data to a national scale and report that in addition to the adaptive management that we're trying to do with the individual landowner. And so we will be doing that through the course of the rest of this fiscal year, and we hope to have a strategic water quality monitoring plan for our edge of field monitoring that we can begin to do for fiscal year 2013. So while we're doing a lot of really, really good things, there's opportunities for us to improve continually, and we can do better next year. Having said that, I'm going to turn it back over to Tom Christensen.
Thank you, Jimmy. I've got a few more slides here I'll go through, and then we'll certainly be glad to take any questions. So in opting to implement in 2012 versus waiting for 2013, we adopted the philosophy of, let's take action and learn now versus letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. In other words, a much longer development period trying for perfection. So we're in the process of assessing lessons learned. We'll be meeting with the EPA here very shortly to have further discussions on that. We've had some discussions with state water quality agencies, and we'll have more later this month, and certainly discussions within NRCS. We know that in some cases we need to improve the level of our coordination at the state level, and certainly we're committed to doing that. We know there were some issues with naming between NRCS and EPA on HUCs, and we'll certainly solve that issue. We may give consideration to additional pollutants, although I don't expect us to go very far off of the sediment and nutrient issue, but things like bacteria, et cetera, will be given consideration. And certainly we're going to begin this process earlier because we will be dealing with a full fiscal year versus a part of a fiscal year. What's next? Again, this is part of a multi-year initiative as mentioned by the President in the proposed 2013 budget. Jimmy has done a good job at discussing monitoring. When it comes to NRCS's cost sharing on edge of field monitoring, we'll be very strategic and judicious about that because where we invest that money and the producer invests that money, we want to have a high likelihood of successful monitoring. In addition, we're still very much focused on outcomes. We're probably got the wrong word in that slide. Probably should be assessing outcomes or moving toward measuring outcomes, but Jimmy has described some of the tools and processes we're going to use, and we're very anxious to learn from the piloting of the Water Quality Index here in 2012. And then I think it's been recognized that we need to establish some more incremental measures of success. Obviously, we'd like to see waters delisted, et cetera, and that's the ultimate goal, but we need some incremental measures of success to know if we're making good progress. So opportunities to improve our overall water quality efforts. This is from an NRCS perspective, but again, the systems approach that we've talked about, and soil health. And I can't say enough about soil health because if you're managing for soil health, which means you're managing for the right biology, the right chemistry, the right structure, et cetera, then that means the rest of your management system is good and you're providing good water quality, et cetera. So you're going to hear a lot more from us about the issue of soil health as the foundation for all conservation work. In addition, we know the importance of technical assistance, and we also know the importance of economics. This all has to make economic sense for the producer so they can maintain that system and they can maintain their operation. We're also very committed to adaptive management. Adaptive nutrient management, for example, is one of the big opportunities out there, and there's some efforts underway with EDF and Iowa Soybean and other organizations that are looking at that in earnest. In addition, innovation is an area that needs to continue to grow. We have conservation innovation grants that provide some opportunity, but we've got to continue to push the frontier on innovation, both from a technology and an approach perspective. We need to further look at our targeting efforts, and we're having internal discussions about that. This issue of getting to the most vulnerable acres is very important. Obviously, this continued collaborative commitment to monitoring, modeling, assessment is so important here. And then there are things that are evolving, such as certainty approaches to water quality. Minnesota, for example, I believe kicked off their official task force under the Ag Commissioner yesterday. Our chief was up there at that meeting. And then we think there are certainly some continuing opportunities for environmental service economic opportunities. So the bottom line here is when we're talking about the fate of water quality in this country, we're really talking about private lands because 70% of the 48 contiguous states is in private ownership, and in fact about 80% of all fresh water either evolves from or crosses private lands in this country, and it's got to be a committed partnership effort at all levels, local, state, and federal. And to wrap this up, this is what we're after here. We're after farming systems that are certainly more productive than they are now, that are more environmentally friendly, and we must have safe food from the field to the table. And to throw another factoid at you, farmers in 1960 produced enough food for about 25 people. Today, that same farmer produces enough food for about 129 people. And that demand is going to grow even greater as population continues to grow. So thank you. We'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Tom and Jimmy, for your presentation. You provided some great background in the work that NRCS is doing. And we do have some time. We're going to take some time to take some questions from our attendees today. And the first question is about nutrient reduction targets. Do you actually look to establish nutrient reduction targets in National Water Quality Initiative priority watersheds?
This is Jimmy, and basically what we do is we work with landowners for nutrient application at agronomic rates based off of the type of vegetation they're growing. So corn might have a different nutrient requirement than with soybeans or even pasture. And also the soils level, type of soils depends, has an input on the amount of nutrients and the ability it has to assimilate nutrient application. So we work more for nutrient management at the field scale level rather than at the watershed level.
Okay, I see. So I guess if they want that to happen, then they should probably work on the EPA side, on the 319 side, to develop a watershed management plan that has a load reduction target, or a TMDL. So, and that sort of leads into sort of how you see on the NRCS side what the anticipated role of EPA and state water agencies in the National Water Quality Initiative. For instance, how much influence would EPA and water agencies have on selecting the projects?
This is Tom Christensen. That's an excellent question. So as we enter into 2013, we certainly want to shore up our coordination at the state level, and what I mean by that is our state conservationists and the state water quality agencies. And we need to make sure that that discussion is occurring early, and they're looking at hopefully reaching consensus on the waters that will be selected. One of the questions that still is out there is, will we be adding additional waters or concentrating on the same ones? And our preliminary thinking is that we want to leave that to the state level, the state conservationist in consultation with the state water quality agency. And then at the national level, we'll certainly continue and further enhance our coordination with EPA. As I mentioned, the lessons learned, I think, will yield some benefits for us that can lead to some improvements in the guidance for 2013.
Okay, well, so that sounds like we have a good process for determining which watersheds will be the priorities, but sort of at the project level, that's strictly an NRCS call, correct?
Well, the use of EQIP funds, which are Farm Bill funds, requires us to ultimately consult with the State Technical Committee. And the State Technical Committee and any other agency, such as the State Water Quality Agency, make recommendations, but ultimately the state conservationist must make the final decision involving the use of EQIP funds. So that was the case this year, and certainly would continue to be the case.
Okay, that's very helpful. And one of the state folks asked, because of the way some states have established the water quality standards, some states do not actually have impairments attributed to nutrients or sediment. Their 303D list of impaired waters is dominated by bacteria. Over half of the 303D listed streams are impaired by bacteria, many of which have a livestock contribution. And I know you mentioned this a little bit, but can you go into a little bit more detail about how that might be factored in for FY13 National Water Quality Initiative?
Yes, and we actually, through the process of collaboration with EPA, the state water quality agencies, have heard the same information, and that is bacteria is a desirable pollutant to focus on in the future. And just as a side note, NRCS Oklahoma, working with a variety of producers in that particular state, have been able to work with that state water quality agency and get over 15 streams delisted because of bacteria from that state's 303D list. So with that in mind, we're interested in learning more about the model that they are using and trying to apply some of those concepts into the future. As Linda mentioned at the outset of this webcast, we actually have gotten out ahead of the game and said we wanted to go ahead and jump in and try to initiate this collaboration and do this work. Bacteria at the outset is one of those pollutants that is very difficult to track exactly what the source is, particularly when you get into those mixed urban and rural interface environments, which you do have dairies and at the same time have waste treatment facilities. And so we wanted to jump in and do this initiative this year, but also just not jump in blindly, jump in with some educated activities that we're pursuing with an eye toward the future, looking at that as a potential pollutant to use as well.
Okay, great. Well, we had a number of questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of them now, but we'll have another break for questions after our next couple of speakers, and we'll open it up for all the speakers to address. That may be appropriate. But so the last question for this segment is one of the participants notes that currently NRCS does not provide state partners with locational data for specific practices they implement, other than perhaps on a county level scale. So how does NRCS expect the state partners to help with monitoring at a field scale level, or do they expect them to help out at that level if they don't sort of share that locational information on the practice that needs to be monitored?
Yeah, that's a great question. We regularly get that question, actually. There are provisions in the Farm Bill that afford privacy to the individual landowners, and so we are bound to honor that privacy, which is why we're actually kind of excited about the outcome approach we just talked about, and that is we can work with the edge of field information, but we want to collaborate with the other agencies in the strategic location of the in-stream water quality monitoring stations, as well as help improve the knowledge base for water quality modeling. So we think that this represents a great new opportunity to leverage, collaborate, and further expand the water quality science, but at the same time not reveal that individual information that the Farm Bill restricts us from doing.
Well, thank you, sir.
Okay, this is Ann Weinberg again. Thank you, Tom and Jimmy, for those answers. I think this webcast has been a tremendous opportunity to collaborate with you further, and it sounds like there's going to be way more collaboration in the future. Our next presentation will be a joint presentation by Steve Hopkins, who's the non-point source coordinator for the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, and then John Hubert, USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service Acting State Conservationist in Iowa, will also talk. So please take it away, Steve. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ann. This is Steve Hopkins from DNR. We'd like to get the first slide rolling. We can?
Page down. Might have to get you.
Give us a minute here while we get that first slide going. John and I are going to play a tag team where we go back and forth and show the different slides. Here's our first slide, just to give you some background on the state of Iowa. We currently have 580 impaired waters in the state of Iowa, and of those impairments, they're predominantly linked to agriculture. That's probably no surprise to the group. In Iowa, we have 90% of the land that's privately owned, and of that land ownership, of that 90% of the land that's privately owned, about 75% of it is cropland. So we obviously have a lot of cropland in the state of Iowa that results in a lot of sediment, phosphorus, nitrogen, and bacterial issues in our waters. The next slide shows a map of the state. This is our impaired waters map. The red squiggly lines are rivers and streams. They're listed as impaired. The blue dots are the lakes in Iowa that are currently impaired. And it gives you an idea that we have a fairly broad distribution of impairments around the state. Of the impaired lakes that we have in Iowa, the three most common types of impairments are algae, turbidity, and bacteria. This is also showing that it's linked to agricultural runoff. And of the impaired stream and river segments in Iowa, the three most common types of impairments are bacteria, biological impairments, and fish kill impairments. And again, most of this is related to agricultural runoff. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to John to give us some information about the NWQI.
On the left side of this slide, you'll see that the National Water Quality Initiative guidelines included a 3 to 5 year projects with sediment and nutrient reduction as one of the goals. And that goes, again, to remove the sediment and nutrient impairments. And then the impairments were to be removed within that 3 to 5 year time frame. And in contrast, I'll turn it over to Steve to cover the 319 project side.
Just to show the differences between how 319 works and how NRCS in this particular program is, our plans in Iowa are typically much longer. Our watershed management plans are 10 to 30 year plans. So that shows a difference between the 3 to 5 year project goal with NWQI. We had similarities looking at the second bullet in that Iowa plans typically are to address sediment and phosphorus reduction, similar to our NWQI program goals. But looking at the third bullet, in Iowa we don't have nutrient stream or lake standards, although we do have nutrient standards for drinking water sources in the state. So there's a somewhat of a program difference there between NWQI, where the goal is to remove sediment and nutrient impairments. And then looking at the last bullet, we expect that to remove an impairment, it would often take longer than 10 years of project implementation before we're actually successful at removing impairments, as opposed to expecting that those impairments could be removed in 3 to 5 years. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it back over to John.
This next slide shows some of the impaired waters in Iowa. We had just over 100 HUC 12 watersheds that were on the 303D list as impaired watersheds. And then moving back to the next slide, I'll turn it back over to Steve and he'll pick it up on that one.
As we were looking at watersheds that we were wanting to select for NWQI, we were looking at this particular list of looking for specifically watersheds where we had an existing 9-element watershed management plan, where we had an existing 319 project, and at the third bullet we thought was perhaps the most important, where we had existing project coordinators that were in place that could sell practices to farmers. We were also hoping that we had existing landowner interest within the watershed selected, that there was existing water monitoring in place, so we had baseline water monitoring data. We're obviously very concerned about whether funds could be quickly obligated, given the short turnaround time in fiscal year 12 with NWQI. And lastly, we're really hoping that we could select the watershed where there was the potential for water quality improvement, and we're very interested in being able to leverage multiple sources of funds through the program. The next slide shows a map of how we were able to narrow down our list of watersheds. We started by looking at this particular map, which is a list of completed 9-element watershed management plan areas within the state of Iowa. And actually, the blue areas are the ones that are completed watershed management plans. The green areas are areas where they're working on plans. So we were hoping to at least begin narrowing down our watersheds by focusing on these blue areas where we had completed 9-element watershed management plans. And from that map, we were able to recommend 3 separate HUC 12 size watersheds. The first one being the Black Hawk Lake watershed of Point. We were looking in northwest Iowa. This was a fairly new 319 project that was completed in 2011. This not only had a watershed management plan, but it had emphasis of work from various sources, including not just DNR, but our Iowa Department of Agriculture and our DNR Lake Restoration Program. So multiple programs were involved in beginning that particular project. The second one, the Rathbun Lake watershed within specifically the Lower Sheraton subwatershed. This is an existing 319 project that's been in place since 2004. This is what we consider as our flagship 319 project in the state, where their watershed management plan had been put together in 2001. They've been working diligently at moving from one subwatershed to another and have a lot of support in that watershed. So we were confident that that would be a good candidate. The third bullet, Badger Creek Lake. This was actually a newly completed watershed management plan completed in 2012. It did not yet have a Section 319 project. However, the planners did submit a 2012 319 application. We felt confident. In particular, this was recommended by the Iowa Department of Agriculture as a potential third watershed for us to focus on. So this gives you an idea of where on the map, after we were able to narrow it down to our three watersheds for NWQI, Blackhawk Lake being the watershed up in northwest Iowa, Badger Creek Lake being in the center, and then the one at the bottom shows the Rathbun watershed. That's the large area, and then within the Rathbun watershed in the blue is the lower South Fork Sheridan River sub-watershed. Moving on to the program timeline that we had in Iowa, we had ongoing discussions between January and March of 2012 this year between us at Iowa DNR, the Iowa Department of Agriculture, and Iowa NRCS, discussing details of what we thought might be coming down the road with the NWQI. So we had a lot of discussions in person, on phone, and then finally, after the NWQI guidelines were released in late March, that's when we had immediately met on March 26th between those three agencies, DNR, Department of Agriculture, and NRCS, and we recommended the three watersheds that were mentioned in the previous slide. And then just several days later, on March 28th, those three watersheds were recommended by the State EQIP Subcommittee to the State Technical Committee. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to John.
One additional step that we did in Iowa with respect to a state-appointed board known as the Water Resources Coordinating Council is we ran the proposal by them for their concurrence as part of our process as well. And this is the actual explanation slide that we used in giving them an idea of not only what watersheds we were moving forward with, but what the reasons were behind those recommendations. And then we also answered questions that they might that they had related to why those watersheds were selected beyond what we were able to put on the slide. The Water Resources Council was convened by the Iowa Secretary of Agriculture. It includes commodity groups, IDNR, which is our State Water Resources Agency, and our State Department of Agriculture, as well as NRCS and others that are involved in the process. And their function is to look at water quality and watershed issues statewide. So that's why we included them in the process. Here for the next slide. For the program timeline, we looked at April 2nd. The three watersheds were recommended by the NRCS State Technical Committee. On April the 24th, the three watersheds were approved by the Iowa NRCS State Conservationist. At that time, it was Rich Sims. And then on May 8th, the National Water Quality Initiative program announcement was officially made, and we began working more earnestly at implementing the project or the initiative. With that announcement, we did put together a special map for that. You will note, if you can read really small print, that there is a difference between our hydrologic unit name in Iowa for the Blackhawk Lake watershed, which its official name with our process is the Wall Lake Inlet. That was not a major obstacle for us. It was just a minor issue related to advertising and getting the word out, and we were able to overcome that easily. For the 2012 National Water Quality Initiative, we ended up with $750,000
Okay, seem to be having some sound difficulties. Steve, are you there? You may need to dial in again. So we're hearing some great information here about Iowa, but we're from Steve and John, but we have a little technical difficulty. Hang in there with us. We will get it back, and we will let them continue their story. We are trying to get Steve and John to dial in back from Iowa, back into the webcast. And meanwhile, we are going to maybe pose a few questions here to Tom and Jimmy about the National Water Quality Inventory while we get Steve and John back on the phone.
So Tom and Jimmy, can we hear you? Can you say something?
Yes.
To allow
yes. We are here.
All right. So some folks have asked, what kind of evaluation and reporting will USDA or EPA be doing, and when to communicate water quality outcomes to these watershed projects? When will they be available to the public?
That is a great question. We mentioned during the earlier presentation, we hope to have our field offices trained on how to do the Water Quality Index for agriculture by July the 30th. And so it will take place probably beginning spring of next year or maybe summer of next year. Why so long even for this relatively simple tool? And the answer is, when we do a contract with an individual landowner, there is a schedule of operations. They don't put all the conservation practices in their contract in right away, or even in the first year, or even in the first 2 years. So we will be collecting information from individual landowners as they put their conservation practices on the ground. I mentioned that we have teams right now that are working on how is it that we're going to collect all that data from individual states, get it to one centralized location, reformat that information in such a fashion that we can begin to articulate that out to the public. Along with that, as part of the lessons learned and the ways that we can offer improvements for the edge of field water quality monitoring activities, we'll be doing a similar exercise. And with that data, we'll also have a lot more collaboration with EPA and USGS and the systems they use to collect, amalgamate data up to the national level, and see how we're complementing and can further leverage resources into the future. So the earliest signs that you can expect to hear back from this initial investment are likely to be toward the end of next winter on into the beginning of next summer from NRCS.
Okay, well, thank you, Jimmy. That's a terrific response. And I think we have Iowa back on the line. So hopefully, Steve and John, are you back?
Yes, we are. Apparently, the phone company decided we needed a short vacation.
We're glad to have you. Go ahead and pick up where you left off.
I'm thinking we left this slide, but if somebody has a better idea, we don't know exactly where we cut out. Does this look right?
Sounds good.
I think so.
Okay. For Iowa, we had $50,000 in EQIP funds available for 2012. That amounted to $250,000 per watershed, and then we were able, on our end, if we needed to be able to adjust those funds based on need and based on a project ranking within the specific watersheds. As it turned out, our Blackhawk Lake watershed received 12 applications totaling $260,000. Our Rathbun Lake Lower Sheraton subwatershed received 25 applications totaling $275,000, and our Badger Creek Lake watershed, because of some extra effort in the watershed, amounted to 41 applications totaling $812,000 requested. And Steve has just a little bit more that he's going to add on that particular watershed.
Badger Creek Lake, that third watershed, that was the one that actually did not have an existing 319 project on the ground, so we were concerned as to whether they'd be able to go ahead and quickly obligate those funds. And as it turned out, they were able to deploy extra NRCS staff in the watershed to make landowner contacts very quickly. And once the landowners started coming in the door within the county, that was Madison County, that's the Swollen Water Conservation District in Madison County where the Badger Creek Lake watershed is located, they were very effectively able to utilize the watershed management plan
and identify the targeted areas for work and use the maps that had been created through the watershed planning effort to identify where the best applications should be targeted, and it worked very effectively. So that was a good surprise for us. For future program considerations, and this is Steve again, just echoing what has been talked about before, we're certainly hoping that there could be earlier program guidance for NWQI, perhaps even in the winter or even before. That would give us a lot more time to be able to discuss the program and not have to run as fast as we did in fiscal year 12. The second bullet is that we're hoping that ranking criteria can specifically be targeted to the pollutant of concern within the watershed, and that there could be points for practices or BMPs in those targeted areas. Specifically, we're really hoping to have that we can target the appropriate practices in the most appropriate areas within the watershed. Looking at the third bullet, given that we feel that it's difficult to be able to show that we can delist an impairment in such a short time frame, we're hoping instead that we could be setting incremental water quality goals rather than just simply the goal of being able to remove an impairment through the program. We're also hoping to be able to very carefully target using an existing water monitoring plan. And I should mention that for areas where we have 319 projects in Iowa, we automatically set aside funds to put together a separate water monitoring plan that can help not only help us provide baseline information, but also help us to track any water quality changes throughout the life of that project. Then looking at the last bullet, we're certainly hoping that there could be longer term or more realistic impairment removal goals affiliated with the NWQI program. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it back over to John.
This last slide just kind of summarizes what we feel were the key principles for our success in getting this off the ground and pulling the partnership together to make it work out well. And key among those was teamwork among the partners before, during, and after the watershed selection process. The communication within the partnership was strong. The transparency and the sharing of key data layers in our selection process helped to streamline that process significantly. And then focusing on the opportunities rather than on the limitations. There was plenty of room for both, but we chose to focus on the opportunities, and we think that made a key contribution to our success so far in the program. And we're looking forward to the continued implementation and next year's opportunity as well. With that, we'll turn it back to you, Ann, for questions or otherwise.
Okay, thank you, Steve and John. We appreciate your information, and we are going to have time for some more questions for you all and for our other speakers, but I need to see my screen. At this time, I'm going to make a few announcements. If your question did not get asked today or you'd like to contact our speakers, you can find their contact information on this slide, which I hope is showing. We are having a little technical difficulty here, but we're going to get the speaker's contact information on the screen soon, so again, you can contact them after the webcast. Here we go. Okay, so these are all our esteemed speakers that we had. We had quite a good group today. And just wanted to let you know that we will be taking a break from webcasts in August. I wish I was going fishing. I'm not sure I'm going fishing, but we will be looking forward to coming back to our next webcast this coming September. Registration will be posted on our website at epa.gov/watershed webcast. So please check back with us regularly, probably in early September. And you can also find the archives of our past webcasts there to tide you over in August if you're wanting to listen to something and learn. And also, please don't forget to download the certificate. This certificate can be downloaded from EPA's server through the link on this slide. And you can personalize the certificate with the names of everyone watching from your location. So now we have time for a few more questions for Steve and John and our other speakers.
Okay, well, terrific. And actually, most of our questions are probably for NRCS still. I think Steve and John did a great job talking about how it's working in Iowa. And I want to focus on next year. Some folks want to know what the time frame will be for next year's joint initiative. When would be the best time to start, looking to get a project or a watershed available for funding under the initiative?
This is Tom Christensen. I think one of the things we'll be doing this month again is meeting with EPA and assessing lessons learned, and then having some internal discussions with our state conservationists too. But we'd like to put our states in a position to coordinate with the state water quality agencies, certainly by early fall, if not sooner. Hopefully latter summer would be the ideal position. Put some guidance out for them so they can begin that coordination process.
Okay, terrific. And along the lines of lessons learned, do you have any sort of that you're ready to sort of, I guess, come forth in this forum and discuss in terms of what are some of the possible differences you might expect between this year's program and next year's program?
Yeah, I think we have a few of them. And Jimmy, I think, alluded to one of those, and that has to do with the size of the watershed. That was a little more problematic. The 12-digit watershed was a little more problematic in the western states where you have fewer producers in a watershed. So I think we may be looking at the opportunity for some variation on the size of the watershed based on justification from that state. That would be one example. I think we'll always be looking at our practice list, and did we afford the right opportunities with the right practices. Another opportunity has to do with the pollutants. The issue of bacteria was another example, and those are a few to come to my mind. I don't know.
Yeah, and this is Jimmy. I think the other ones were that Iowa also reiterated, and we've kind of talked about it and have a plan to address as well, and that is the time frame in trying to start the process early. One of the challenges we all faced this year was the fact that our chief made the decision to get in this particular game for this purpose late in the process. So actually we did a really good job of getting everything organized, getting states trained, having the collaboration with states, and getting the program implemented this year. So the additional time frame that we expect to afford our states next year will be a tremendous improvement as well.
Okay. Any word on whether or not it'll still remain at 5% of the EQIP funding for targeted watersheds, or are we looking at something potentially higher?
That's another decision has yet to be made, and will need to be discussed, certainly with the chief of NRCS. But there's no decision yet at this point on the level of funding. Okay,
I know a few folks who might be rooting for higher. So put that in there as an EPA person. But we think it's a terrific partnership and collaboration that we have. In terms of the monitoring component, how is the monitoring component of the National Water Quality Initiative being coordinated with other national monitoring programs or state or local watershed monitoring programs? And I guess another possibility for the national scale, federal scale, would be USGS's NWQI program. Any coordination there?
Well, this is Tom Christensen again with NRCS. Let me address it from an NRCS perspective. When it comes to water quality monitoring, the only piece that NRCS actively cost shares on is edge of field monitoring. And so far we have restricted the use of that practice to the MRBI and select watersheds where the partners through their CCPI proposal have described the three-tiered approach to monitoring. What we have done, though, in NRCS is we've taken a step back. We have a moratorium on additional cost sharing of edge of field monitoring as we're revisiting our technical criteria and also revisiting information such as the siting of monitoring, what are the ideal conditions to get the kind of results we would hope for, that sort of thing. So what we anticipate is shoring all of that up in the next few months, and then moving forward in 2013 with some decisions about where we will cost share on edge of field monitoring. So one of the questions that will have to be answered is, will we provide cost sharing on that practice in the context of the National Water Quality Initiative? Will we provide cost sharing on it outside of MRBI? So those are decisions yet to be made, but we anticipate within a few months' time being in a position to make those decisions.
Okay, sounds great. I appreciate that. One of your slides pointed out, there's a number of sort of regional initiatives that the NRCS is involved with, and prior to FY12 as well, and EPA is involved with some of those initiatives as well, particularly with the Chesapeake Bay and the Great Lakes regions. And I'm wondering if you can kind of explain how this new effort will be coordinated with those other regional programs?
Well, that's an excellent question, too. As you mentioned, we started some of these landscape scale initiatives in NRCS as long as 3 years ago, and major ones being Chesapeake Great Lakes, which of course is funded by EPA GLRI funding, and the Mississippi River Basin Healthy Watershed Initiative. We have some others beyond that, but those are the major ones from a water quality perspective. And to give you an idea of scope, here under the National Water Quality Initiative, we mentioned that we funded 157 12-digit HUCs this year. Well, under MRBI, since its inception in 2010, we're somewhere between 400 and 500 12-digit HUCs that have been funded at an accelerated rate. So probably when you add all these up, across these major watersheds plus NWQI, you're getting close to 1,000 of these small targeted watersheds where we have accelerated efforts underway. And one of the things we're discussing and planning to do here in NRCS is kind of take a step back again and take an inventory of that, making sure we understand what's going on in each of these watersheds from a resource commitment, from a partnership perspective, so that we can talk a little more definitively about these targeted watershed efforts and then further explore the continuing opportunities for collaboration with state water quality agencies, EPA, and others. So we're very interested. For example, we know that some of these water quality initiative watersheds overlap with the major landscape initiatives, and we need to do a deeper dive there to find out the nature of that overlap. Is the overlap in the same exact 12-digit watershed? What is being brought to bear there from the initiative versus NWQI versus partners? So that's also on our game plan, is to do a deeper dive, find out what is going on from a collaborative perspective, find out the gaps, and then find out from that the opportunities.
In time for the FY13 awards, I suppose?
Yeah, we're hoping to do that on an accelerated time frame, yes.
Yeah, so we'll all be busy. Maine and Alaska have a number of watersheds that are very high quality, exceptionally high value, but threatened, not yet impaired. And I'm just wondering if some of those, and other states as well, but those two states really jump out. And I'm just wondering if you have, if that will be considered for the next round of funding.
Yeah, this is Jimmy Bramblett, and what you might recall we talked about during the in our portion of the presentation is that there were 4 categories of water bodies that we said were eligible for inclusion in the National Water Quality Initiative. The first were those streams that were on the 303D list, that is, they had documented water quality problems. The second was the category of threatened streams, and those were ones for which water quality data exists. They're not necessarily listed as impaired, but they are threatened and are moving in the direction to be listed as impaired. And those are certainly eligible for inclusion in the National Water Quality Initiative and was part of the criteria from which state conservationists had an opportunity to choose as well.
Okay, that sounds good. Do we have time for one more question? All right, we'll ask one more question. I'm getting a thumbs up here. And I guess sort of who decides what EQIP practices can be used for each state? And how do you determine between core and supporting practices? I guess it's a two-part question.
Okay, this is Jimmy, and I'll take a stab at it at first and invite the other NRCS participants to add to it as well. But we have a tool that we didn't talk about today. We call it CPPE. And what that stands for is conservation practice, physical effects. And each practice, we look at a variety of resource concerns: soil erosion, wildlife habitat, air quality, energy savings, water conservation, and water quality. And there's an assessment made by our technical specialist and our scientists as to how positive an impact is of each individual conservation practice on all of those resource concerns. And so that tool basically is a planning tool, and the concept of moving from looking at the initial positive or no impact on the resource concern, moving it to a core and/or supporting practice, it has to do with the systems approach. We didn't talk a lot about this today, but we have a concept we use that we call avoiding, trapping, and controlling pollutants. And that is, we try to make sure that we avoid the movement of pollutants off-site to start with certain types of practices. Just think in terms of pasture and hayland planting, or some other kind of vegetative or crop residue type of practice that helps reduce soil erosion. People can kind of quickly grasp that. And then if we can't avoid it from moving, we do try to control the movement of that pollutant so that if it does move, it doesn't move particularly far. And then if, in fact, it does move far and we think it's actually going to be lost off the edge of the field, we try to have some other type of a practice like a field border or some other kind of riparian buffer that might trap it and avert that pollutant from ever reaching the stream. So those core practices are the ones that really help achieve those primary functions associated with the positive impacts associated with water quality pollutants.
Well, thank you, sir. And that concludes all the time we have for questions. I'll turn it over to Ann now.
Okay, thank you all. At this time, I'd like to conclude today's webcast. Thank you, Linda, Tom, Jimmy, Steve, and John for presenting today. And, of course, thanks to everyone who joined us. That ends our webcast for today. Thanks again. Have a good day.